Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, as the sun set on April 11, we assessed the immediate response to the toxic chemical release near Alberton, Montana. We now continue with Part 1, Chapter 12, Containment. Epigraph. We're in this for the long haul. From MRL's incident motto. As reward for a long day, Missoula Hazmat's John Fiddler was assigned night ops. Just before midnight, Incident Command advised Hazmat of a strong smell at Tammy Weingart's residence just north of the Huson exit, about 12 road miles from the spill. Fiddler started a busy night. Friday, April 12, Day 2. Self-evacuated, Tammy Weingart returned home that evening, but the smell remained. It was about 10 o'clock at night, she said, and I called 911 again, and I said, they sent our whole family back here, and it still smells like a swimming pool. And I said, we are all just supposed to stay here? I don't understand this. Hazmat arrived after midnight and reported 0 readings. By the time they got up here, she said, it was like 12:30 at night, and it had started raining, so that cleaned it out of the air. Weingart was upset with MRL. They told my husband it was perfectly fine to bring his family back. If there was the slightest case, the slightest potential for endangering my family, they should have kept us out of here. I told them it's like bleach all over my house. I told them I had a sore throat. Weingart never noticed chlorine again at her house, but did detect another smell. A few times, she said, I just remember thinking, well, somebody put fertilizer out because it would give me a headache. I don't know what it was, but I could smell it. Weingart's sister, Deborah Ishler, lived a mile north of the Huson exit, returning after 5 p.m. You could smell that chlorine, she said. It wasn't as concentrated as it was in the morning, but you could still smell it for probably a week. She said her husband also mentioned almost a fertilizer-type smell after a couple days. Being outside aggravated a severe cough that Ishler had developed. The morning of April 12, she called the MRL hotline. They said, your area is, a safe zone. You're fine. Don't worry about it. A little smell isn't going to bother you. Ishler felt her family should have been evacuated at least a week. 17 miles to the west, complaints came in from Sear, 3.7 road miles from the spill at the western boundary of the exclusion zone. At 12:10 a.m., IC advised Missoula Hazmat that they had received a call of chlorine smell at the Sear exit roadblock. Complainant said he had been exposed this morning and is evacuating to Superior. The roadblock had no monitor. At 12:40 a.m., Fiddler's team met the resident at the roadblock and went to his home to monitor. They found 0 readings. Then at 1:44 a.m., Mineral County Sheriff's Office logged, Jim Peters called, reporting chlorine smell at Hart Ranch in Sear. He was advised to leave if he could smell chlorine. Peters worked at the ranch. Instead, at 2:12 a.m., Peters called again to advise of strong chlorine smell, stated he tried to contact everyone in Sawmill Gulch. Mineral County Dispatch advised Peters to leave and said they would take care of the rest. Peters reportedly told neighbors to evacuate, claiming he was 911. A deputy advised Peters to stop or he would be jailed. Missoula Hazmat got word that Peters reported a strong smell and was getting sick. When Fiddler's team returned to Sear exit at 2:49 a.m., they again reported 0 readings. But at 3:10 a.m., as Fiddler prepared to leave, Missoula Hazmat noted pesticide sprayed earlier this date per 911. 911 had told Hazmat that a pesticide had been sprayed in the area earlier on April 11. Fiddler's sparse personal log noted at 2 a.m., Sear area problem smelled like pesticide. At 3 a.m., he noted, pesticide spray confirmed, the confirmation from 911. With the chaos of the spill and evacuations, it seemed improbable that anyone in the area would have sprayed pesticides, especially in early April with rain. Most remarkably, Jim Peters lived within the evacuation zone, which included all of Sawmill Gulch. Evacuation had been called for as far west as Sear, and responders confirmed that gas had traveled at least as far as Fish Creek on April 11, another 3.5 miles to the west. Officials from both counties were clearly aware that people near Sear and in Sawmill Gulch had not been evacuated, an area occupied by many families. Yet, even amid complaints of smells and a resident's call for evacuation, no one questioned why these people remained in the exclusion zone. Peters wasn't the only complaint. From 2:40 a.m. through 4 a.m., Mineral County Sheriff's log noted several people have called or come out to the roadblock saying there is strong chlorine smell at Sear, All were advised that the hazmat crew has gotten no readings. Any airborne chemicals above the river could slip towards Sear, especially at night. As for the pesticide smell, a Sear area landowner who was rumored to be associated with the alleged spraying later denied that he had sprayed anything. But the people unaccountably left in the exclusion zone smelled something. Sawmill Gulch was the major residential cluster west of Plateau Road. The mouth of Sawmill was about 2 road miles from the spill, the same as the west end of Alberton. By air closer, but with a mountain bulge in the way. Further west, the Superior Ambulance had stopped at Fish Creek on April 11 because the chlorine gas is really strong, they said, and by 9 a.m., Sergeant Ball understood from Sheriff O'Brien that gas was visible at Sear. Nothing more was logged about gas to the west. Some Sawmill Gulch families heard of impending evacuations by the Mineral County Sheriff's Department early on April 11, but they never happened. Shirley Anderson called the sheriff's office, and they said no, she said. They weren't evacuating that area. She noticed a chlorine smell, but no serious symptoms. Paris Young lived in the hills and noticed the smell that evening. It didn't smell too bad, he said, like walking by a jacuzzi or hot tub, but the next day was the same thing. Young and guests self-evacuated on April 12. I noticed they started transposing syllables, he said, and when I had my eyes examined quite a bit later, they told me that my eyes had been scratched by the stuff. I was not evacuated, Young criticized. They put my health at risk. There was a huge amount of chlorine released, as well as the potassium cressolate, so there's ample opportunity for wild chemical reactions. Young thought, if they'd got me out immediately, I think I'd escaped with very little damage. The land, my home, the water, got really dosed. Young's partner, Robbie Flynn, evacuated with Young. I had to go to the emergency room, she said. Flynn had pre-existing asthma. Diane and Larry Roberts and their 2 young children lived right by the Sear exit. The first time Diane smelled anything was late at night. Our neighbor called and said, "It's coming this way, and you better get out," she said. Jim Peters, up at the Hart Ranch. So we grabbed our children and dogs and went to the Sear exit roadblock. The guy up there at the trailer said, "Well, Peter's just a drunk, and the Meads had sprayed for pesticide. They said we wasn't being evacuated. Well, we sure couldn't afford to stay in a motel without being, so we just came back home." "Well, how stupid," Roberts said. "You know, we wasn't even thinking. Of course he wouldn't have sprayed at that time. In fact, I talked to Harvey Mead, and he said no one had sprayed out here." Jim Peters was right. Roberts recalled an odor like chlorine in a swimming pool, but really strong. Early on April 12, Shirley Anderson received a call from Peters, who said we were being evacuated. "I opened the door and the smell was atrocious," she said. "I know what chlorine smells like. This was altogether different. It was rotten, like something that would want to make you throw up. Something like a real strong weed killer. I mean, it was really overwhelming." Peters called her back, saying he was told by someone that it was just a pesticide or some stupid thing that our neighbor up above us had sprayed, and our neighbor had not sprayed a thing. Larry Price of Superior volunteered with Mineral County Search and Rescue and helped staff the roadblock at Sear the evening of April 11. Price noticed an acrid smell that tingled in your nose, chlorine, but not just chlorine. There was something else in it, he said, kind of sweeter. Within 4 hours, I coughed and had blood, raw red blood. Price developed a dry, sore throat, sinuses and eyes, and shortness of breath, along with a headache and bleeding gums. Price believed these symptoms indicated more than chlorine exposure, but according to I.C. Waldron, he worked in an area safe from any exposure. "But see," Price said, "this is the thing I brought up the first day I was there to the command, was that chlorine settles." When Sawmill residents and the roadblock crew started complaining of a pesticide smell, we called in and said there was a change in odor, and they, at the spill site, said, "Well, it's not us. Somebody must be putting out chemicals. Check and see." The roadblock crew was told to check Harvey Mead's property between the mouth of Sawmill Gulch and the roadblock north of the river. That deputy and I, we went up there and talked to Mr. Mead and asked him if he had put out any fertilizer or anything. Mead said no. "And it wasn't as strong up there as it was as down at the roadblock," Price said. IC's response, Price said, was, "Well, we don't know where it came from." You have to understand that after the first 4 hours of my shift, it had to be something really strong, because Price's sinuses were overloaded and flowing. Mineral County Commissioner Charlie Rock corroborated the falsehood of blaming the pesticide-like smell on Harvey Mead, whom Rock called. He said he hadn't sprayed, Rock said. Despite chlorine having reached the Sear area and beyond, Mineral County Sheriff Mickey O'Brien decided against evacuation, leaving residents behind in the exclusion zone. The overnight complaints of chlorine were dismissed after monitoring, and a pesticide-like smell falsely attributed to someone spraying pesticides. Near dawn, Missoula Hazmat began monitoring near the site, noting 0 readings around the derailment area and in Alberton. But readings only indicated a given time and place. At 9:51 a.m., Hazmat logged no readings from around derail site, release increasing with radiant heat from the sun. While monitoring was 0, a visible chlorine release continued and grew. In addition to a shortage, monitors often malfunctioned. Detected or not, chlorine continued to leak. By 10 a.m., a unified command was established, consisting of Frenchtown Fire Chief Scott Waldron, Sergeant Dave Ball of the Missoula County Sheriff's Office, a Missoula City County Health Department member, and MRL's Vice President Dan Watts. Despite the unified command, Waldron said he became the lead incident commander by the grace of 2 county commissioners of Mineral and Missoula County, he said. Note, UC and IC were generally interchangeable in the logs. When referring to a person, IC generally meant Waldron. A former volunteer, Waldron became Frenchtown Fire District Chief in 1991, the district's lone paid firefighter. He earned an associate's degree in fire science from Montana State University. Waldron recalled that the morning of April 12, Emerald Watts came to Frenchtown Fire Station. He walked up and said, "Hi, I'm Dan Watts, and I'm going to be your operations section chief." And I said, "No, you're not. I had the responsibility to look out for public safety, and he had the responsibility to look out for his railroad and public safety." So we had a talk, and we said, "We're going to be a unified command, and we'll have operations people that understand operations, and you and I will be the incident commanders." And we shook hands and went forward from there. Law enforcement and the health department would round out an unusual unified command. Right after, Waldron left his small office in the corner of the truck bay, now literally full of people, he said, standing around. So I stood on a chair about in the middle of the bay, and I shouted, "Shut up! And if you don't have a reason to be here, get out!" As Waldron recalled, the Coast Guard was there, as well as FEMA, though he apparently confused FEMA with the EPA in his memory. "We kind of had to sort out who was in charge," he said. "Coast Guard, a cute little redhead from over in Washington, was telling me she was the boss because it was a navigable waterway. The guy from FEMA was telling me he was in charge, and none of us had the authority and capability to manage it." Waldron decided he was in charge. Missoula Health Department Director Ellen Leahy characterized Waldron as incident commander, with other unified command representatives in support roles. "We listened to each other," Leahy said. But this particular unified command included a representative from MRL, the private responsible party, as a co-commander. Waldron agreed this was not common. "But it felt right for this kind of an incident," he said. "They had lots of resources. They were willing to work within the system. It was beneficial to everybody involved, I think, that we included them as a full partner there." But the setup was even more uncommon. Below IC or UC came the Incident Command System General Staff of 4 sections: Operations, Logistics, Finance, and Plans. Lieutenant Mike McMeekin of the Missoula County Sheriff's Office became the Operations Chief, or rather, one Operations Chief. This system was different from anything McMeekin had ever seen. For whatever reason, he said, we had parallel incident management structures, public sector and MRL. Instead of one operations chief, there were 2, and so on. And then you had their own organizations underneath them, he said. Every one of the command general staff positions was duplicated, and that's highly unusual. It's the only incident I've ever been on where they had that. On MRL's side, every person was either MRL employees or MRL appointed. McMeekin had no idea why this parallel structure was set up. In most situations, that really wouldn't work, he said. But in this case, he thought everyone worked together well with MRL. But the parallel structures weren't merely duplicates. MRL's command structure was set up to oversee the spill site exclusively. They were taking care of the scene, McMeekin said. Outside the scene was ours. The unique command structure was obviously MRL's idea, agreed to by Waldron. This was the Missoula Health Department's first involvement in an incident command. McMeekin called public health arguably the single biggest responsibility of any of the government agencies involved. Health Department Director Leahy said the spill was out of her jurisdiction and that the Missoula County Commissioners had to loan the Health Department out at the request of Mineral County, which had few resources. In reality, this was very much a transboundary spill, and evacuees came from both counties. Only the derailment site was exclusively in Mineral County. The Health Department initially found itself marginalized. Ben Schmidt represented the agency until Leahy took over a few days into the incident. We had a lot of disagreements with MRL the first few days, Schmidt recalled. MRL thought that the health department should be excluded from meetings, and they didn't understand that, no, we had a right and a responsibility to be at things like that. Schmidt had the impression that MRL tried to basically take over the cleanup with the Frenchtown Fire Department right at the very beginning, he said. He thought Waldron was part of the problem, clearly unaware that the Unified Command System was really three distinct branches involved in the decision-making process: fire, law, and health. But more so, Schmidt pointed to MRL, the unique fourth branch on this Unified Command. They thought they were sometimes totally in charge of the site, he said, just like at the beginning, trying to meet without the health department being involved with the real planning meetings. Schmidt called on the help of Jim Carlson, the director of the health department's Environmental Health Division, to intervene, which ended the exclusion at meetings. Waldron, who called the Unified Command setup with MRL very unique, claimed Montana Rail Link owned the ground. They had the train. They could have easily said, "Get off of our property and we'll deal with this. And all we could do is protect the public." In fact, MRL leased the line from Burlington North and Santa Fe, and the federal government had authority because a federal highway was closed, and also because of substantial endangerment to public health and the environment. MRL had no exclusive control. Indisputably, being on the Unified Command as well as setting up a parallel command structure for the site gave MRL much more control than normal. By the end of the first day, it appeared that MRL and its contractors would call the shots at the spill scene. IC noted April 12, "The technical specialists will make the decisions." The tech group was under MRL control. The techs quickly outlined their decisions at the morning's IC meeting. MRL would set up a mobile trailer near the Natural Pier Bridge for the Forward Operations Center. They would hire Marine Environmental to monitor gas levels in the area. The techs declared a 600-foot radius of work zone as the core of the overall hot zone. MRL created a pet livestock rescue plan to allow escorted residents to visit or rescue animals. The technical specialists, they said, will be the drivers. Incident Command will support their decision. And, MRL said, MRL will hold daily meetings at 2 p.m. for evacuees, phrased as MRL meetings. Media releases, at least, must go through Incident Commander Waldron. Tim Murphy of the State Emergency Response Commission would serve as a liaison for state government. At this private IC meeting, Murphy warned that the EPA could be political. This was the first mention in local logs of the EPA, an agency not yet mentioned in the media. Murphy viewed the federal government skeptically, not as a partner. A special Superfund response alert from the EPA was released at 11 a.m., reflecting information that the EPA had received by April 12. They noted 3 out of 4 chlorine tank cars were punctured, causing a chlorine vapor cloud. Continue to have intermittent releases of vapor. This report made no mention of the potassium cresslate. Apparently, the EPA was getting information through IC and MRL and was not directly investigating. Any expertise the federal responders had to bring to the table would be foolish to ignore. At 11 a.m., Missoula hazmat suited up to escort chlorine teams to the site. Ziegler took video of 2 trips on April 12. He recalled no sign of a residual gas cloud in the Alberton area or plume at the site. The first video ended after a short recon from his truck while stopped at Reardon Crossing. Ziegler zoomed in on the wreck and caught a man just beyond the tanks, climbing down from a derailed car with no apparent protection but a hard hat. In the second video, Ziegler's vehicle crossed the tracks and then he began taping on foot in level 8 protection, with SCBA at the ready. The sunny scene was quiet as he approached to within 20 feet of the tanks. Unlike adjacent chlorine tanks tilted towards him, the Cresslate tank was tilted to the south, its rupture at its low end, butted against the known chlorine leaker, an indication of a heavy spill. A faint white or grayish vapor rose above the tanks. then more vapors from between the chlorine leaker and the potassium cressolate tank. The sun was coming out. It was getting warm, Ziegler said. Fumes were starting to come off. Ziegler felt nervous. Soon, he hopped back in the truck, taping as they drove off. Ziegler's team crossed the tracks and approached the wreck from the south to fill more cars and placards. Chlorine readings were 0 on the monitor. They crept past the rail piece, twisted into an arch, stopping about 50 feet short of the end of the chlorine tank that lay in the ditch. Ziegler again forayed with his camera on foot, zooming in on the other tanks and an empty gondola car. Some pines looked dead brown. On the back side of the car, he said, we saw the blue gas starting. I turned to my partner and said, we need to go, now. Time to leave. The ground was heating up. It's starting to off-gas now, Ziegler said, and vaporize out of the thing. As they pulled out, an odd bluish gas rose from among the orange-splattered cars and soil, next to the ditch, a purplish goo. The EPA's Chris Weiss explained chlorine's auto-refrigeration as wherever the liquid was exposed to an air surface with water vapor, the cold liquid formed an ice skin. Liquid chlorine in the soil could ice at its surface as well. The tank was tipped at about 8 degrees, he said, and so there was a puddle or large pool of material that had shuttled down to one end of the tank. In a freeze-thaw cycle, the ice would melt and the chlorine would boil and cool, evaporative cooling basically, and then become viscous and not so volatile. A renewed ice skin formed upon the extremely cold liquid. Though no one knew at the time, Car 3 was not empty. Life would be easier for the techs if the whole tank load had simply vaporized. Typically, a rupture left the tank half full of chlorine, the Chlorine Institute's Jack Ahern explained, because as it goes from liquid to gas, it takes a lot of energy, and all of a sudden it freezes up. So there's no more heat left, so you're stuck with half a tank, he said, of a deadly liquid belching deadly gas. Ziegler never again went past Reardon's Crossing. As the hazmat safety officer, normally he would have been responsible for deciding who entered the site. Missoula Hazmat, along with teams from Billings and Great Falls, monitored and stood by in case of a new release. Hazmat would also help feed animals left behind in the greater hot zone. Ziegler: basically, we just sat around for a while. It was just kind of boring. The techs gathered new information. MRL knew that, quote, approximately 17,000 gallons of potassium cressolate spilled, leaving almost 3,000 in the tank. But information on the cressolate was released publicly at a trickle. Hazmat's Fiddler recalled, I don't know that I ever heard an amount of cressolate spilled, having no idea if it were a lot or a little. Envirocon sampled both chlorine and cressolate impacted soils for pH. Noting visibly stained soil on the south side tracks measured 10.28, very basic pH. Adjacent stained soils in the south ditch measured 3.57, very acidic. The techs understood the bulk of the cressolate and the bulk of at least one chlorine tank had released side by side. The tech group included one or more members from MRL, M-Tech Environmental, a hazmat company that removed the sodium chlorate, Envirocon, an MRL sister company that removed soils and tested water, Team Inc. that did tank patching, Holcher Services, who moved rail cars, the Association of American Railroads, and a health and safety representative. Georgia Pacific, the chlorine producer, and OxyChem, who sampled for chlorine and produced sodium chlorate, had unlimited representation as product specialists. Missoula Rural Fire Department's Paul Lazy attended the tech group's planning sessions strictly as a liaison for Unified Command. ChlorRep team members arrived as well from Dow Chemical, which mobilized industry personnel and equipment to respond to chlorine emergencies. The techs now declared the yardstick for the worst-case scenario was 14 more days, April 26. Once flowing, they expected it would take 12 to 16 hours to transfer chlorine from each damaged car. A team led by Georgia Pacific had measured vapor pressures. Car 1 had 77 psi, Car 2 95, Car 3 0, Car 4 60 psi. The techs believed Car 3 empty, having no pressure. Car 4 was a concern because, loaded at 85 psi, was now only 60 psi. Car 4 also had ice on it, sign of a possible leak. The techs modeled that, under current conditions, a major gas release would reach 9 Mile exit in about 72 minutes. They also noted There is no potassium cresslate on the ground. Everything has soaked in. For the offloading of chlorine, 12 empty chlorine tankers, 2 full caustic tankers, sodium hydroxide for neutralizing, and 2 empty caustic cars were en route. Tomorrow, Holcher would begin to clear the track and lay temporary panel track. The animal rescue and feed might begin tomorrow, the text said. The techs would assess at daybreak. Meanwhile, they noted, EPA personnel have been at the 9 Mile command post, asking questions. Emerald's Watts would give them the information they need. A marginalized spectator, the EPA was not part of the tech group or unified command. Emerald's representatives had assumed the paramount roles of planning the transfer of the chemicals, sampling for contamination, planning for cleanup, assessing the evacuation, holding evacuee meetings, and planning for resident visits. This was MRL's show. As the techs considered whether to allow residents back to retrieve or feed pets and livestock, rumors spread of unconfirmed reports of dead animals in the area. Wild animal injuries or deaths would be expected, especially close to the site, just as vegetation damage. No survey of wild animal casualties took place. Dead animal rumors heightened concern for domestic animals left behind, whose care was a practical concern regardless. Incident Command and MRL conducted a test rescue run Friday afternoon up Petty Creek. Carol and John Greenwood lived 1 mile up Petty Creek. We were a test group to see how fast people could get in and get out to take care of their animals, Carol said, one of 4 families participating. The Greenwoods went in with a deputy and removed 3 foaling mares and fed 17 other horses within 20 minutes. No one wore protective gear, but the plan was to get out if anyone smelled anything strong. A chlorine monitor apparently detected nothing, John said. Yet, he said, there were pockets of it that you could smell in the pasture. There was definitely pockets of that gas there for several days. The test run was deemed a success. As the day warmed and gas rose from the spill site, the Emergency Operations Center received calls from people east and west of the exclusion zone, claiming to smell chlorine. Within the exclusion zone, peripheral monitoring later in the day showed no readings. The lack of readings convinced officials that the area beyond the broad hot zone was safe for the next day's animal rescue, and monitoring would continue Saturday morning. At 2 p.m., the first evacuee meeting was held at the Red Lion Inn in Missoula, with a panel to give information and answer questions. According to IC, MRL held these meetings and published handouts summarizing each one. The official evacuee meeting minutes were more detailed, but included few quotes. An estimated 300 to 400 people attended the first meeting. I.C. Waldron announced the evacuation could last 14 days. MRL's Dan Watts said people would probably be able to return home with an escort to feed livestock and pets. Chris Hohol spoke for the tech group, saying 5 cars are damaged, but some cars do have pressure. He said there was some caustic chemicals on the ground, the only mention regarding the potassium cresslate. Once transloading starts, he said, it does become dangerous. There could be significant chlorine gas releases. A home reentry plan would be made before evacuees could return to stay. A plan will be in place to monitor the air in the homes, the text said, a reassuring promise. No questions were summarized in this meeting's sparse minutes. In fact, no audience questions or comments were recorded until the meeting of April 14. The Saturday Missoulian shed light on what had actually been an emotional gathering. Hohol said that all 4 chlorine tankers had breached, with much of the substance leaked, he said, and 1 car actually may be close to empty. The chlorine continued to leak in, quote, minuscule amounts during freezing and thawing of ice. Little sign of chlorine had been detected in the air monitoring beyond the wreck, he said. But Hohol cautioned that precipitation or movement of the cars during the offloading process could result in a major release. Once pumping began, it could take 2 weeks of round-the-clock effort to secure the remaining chlorine. The audience gasped in dismay. April 26. Containment, then, was relative. The chlorine beast could escape again and again, and this was the reason for the continued evacuation. Hohol made a statement in the paper that apparently made no impact and would soon be forgotten. Buried in the back page of the news article, he said that, quote, crystallic sodium, a derivative of sodium hydroxide, was also leaking in a minuscule amount. This was the potassium crestlate solution, still not properly identified. The Missoulian had earlier reported that the tank leaked, quote, only slightly and very locally, but never reported that 17,000 gallons had already spilled. Hohol said the caustic liquid, quote, does not give off a gas, but is dangerous if inhaled. Hohol didn't explain how something that gave off no gas could be inhaled. He said, it made the cloud look worse, much worse than it actually was, about the mixture of the two chemicals. This interesting statement begged for follow-up. How had the crestlate made the cloud look worse? Was he referring to the large, persistent blue-gray cloud near Alberton most of Thursday? Hohol stated there had been a mixture of the crestlate and the chlorine. What did this mean? What chemicals had spread in the cloud besides chlorine? By all published accounts, no one asked such questions. Not officials, not the media. Chemist Garen Smith said later that Hohol's statement about the cloud doesn't make any sense to me. For the audience, the hot topic was animals left behind, described in the paper as the biggest issue. Amid angry outbursts and interruptions, I.C. Waldron emphasized the need for safety. Horses and cattle are giving birth, and we've got to get in there and get food and water to those animals, shouted one man. Will you go 24 hours without eating? Yelled another. Hohol explained that the technical crew advised to wait until Saturday to allow people in for short blocks of time to care for animals, if conditions remain stable. We don't care about the technical advice, someone interrupted. Wasn't it technical people that put that train together? Another evacuee asked. In a separate interview, Waldron told the Missoulian, I would rather have you go home and complain for the rest of your lives that we kept you out too long than allow you in for 1 minute and have an occurrence where you get injured and complain that we didn't keep you out. The techs already planned for the visits as a practical matter, but now officials faced angry residents. Dead animal rumors heightened residents' concerns. The techs would assess conditions at daybreak before authorizing the visits. The issue was chlorine stability at the site. But there were options. Get the animals all out or leave them in. Have residents come in or have responders feed or evacuate the animals. The ultimate plan would be to leave the animals in place, unless residents wanted to extract any, and to escort residents periodically to care for animals. In the delineated hot zone, responders would do the feeding. But complaints went beyond animals left behind. Lucinda Hodges recalled the first evacuee meeting in an overflowing hotel conference room. Her husband, Mark Hansen, left early. He was pissed, she said, and never came back for another meeting, ever. Officials assured, she said, you're only out of your homes in case there's another accidental release at the site. But it was perfectly safe in Alberton. Mark's like, if that's the truth, then I want to go home, because I can get out if there's another release. Hodges didn't know the Unified Command Team and didn't trust them. Deborah Griffin recalled MRL's Dan Watts showing some footage, she said, and of course everybody gasped when they saw the cloud. And his explanation was, oh, that's not all chlorine, that's just steam from the chemical reaction. And he just dismissed it, like it was no big deal. But I remember a lot of angry people. The media images put a face to the monster that had struck in the night. The reaction of cold liquid chlorine converting to gas did condense water vapor, but the dense cloud was also saturated with HCl and HOCl, hydrochloric acid and hypochlorous acid, if not more. Larry Mickelson recalled that MRL had a doctor speak. Dr. Peschel knew very little about chlorine, Mickelson said, but he said that in the last 24 hours he had been reading up on chlorine, and he told everybody that we would be fine by Monday. That was pretty much a blanket statement. Yet medical advice and action on basic decontamination was lacking. Many evacuees wore the same clothes in which they evacuated the previous day. Randy Crisco said his family's clothes still stunk, as did the clothes of others at the meeting. Robbie Flynn recalled, so all the people came to these meetings and the smell in those rooms was just awful. My eyes would water. Nancy Shugg said that after her family spent a few days in their motel room, maids started coming in with masks and gloves, and I come to find out these girls were getting sick just by coming in our room in that short amount of time. They were being exposed to us, Shugg said. Meanwhile, evacuees were stuck in Missoula with practical concerns. When officials said it might be 2 weeks before they could return, Hodges went to MRL because she had no money. She had fled Alberton with a coat over her pajamas, and her kids needed clothes too. She heard about the J.C. Penney deal, a voucher for getting clothes. At the Emerald office, an administrator demanded identification. Hodges. She said, well, you've got three choices. You can either have a voucher so that you can go get clothes for yourself and family for $150 a piece at J.C. Penney, or $150 cash advance total to buy whatever, or you can have a prescription filled for your glasses so you can see. But you can't have all three. You need to make a choice. Clothes, cash, or eyeglasses. And I should have known right then, Hodges said, but I just let her push me around. And I said, well, I guess I'll take the J.C. Penney so I can get something for everybody. But it was ridiculous. She was a bitch. Right then you could see people being treated differently. Right from the beginning, there was no equity. Hodges was told at the store that she had to use up all the vouchers at once, $450 worth of clothing. But there wasn't much to choose from because other evacuees had been doing the same. She ended up buying items like $75 tennis shoes for the kids and felt ripped off. The stress of the evacuation took its toll in other ways. Hodges had moved her family into a motel, but even though it appeared the evacuation would stretch on, Mark Hansen decided to stay in Frenchtown. It was like everybody's relationship changed the minute this whole thing happened, Hodges said. I felt like he was just staying in Frenchtown. I was kind of on my own. I think we were all already having brain impact problems, communication problems, and we weren't realizing it. I don't know how to explain it. I just couldn't think right after that. Friday afternoon, forward operations set up at the Natural Pier Bridge, and forward command was established at Station 5 near Petty Creek. Though forward ops was just within the edge of the broad hot zone, not quite 3/4 of a mile from the spill, it was considered a safe area. Everyone who didn't need to be at forward ops was stationed at Station 5, including Missoula Hazmat. Station 5 lay within the exclusion zone, with evacuated homes to the east. The techs recommended I-90 remain closed, the major link west of Missoula. Yet, with the detour, there were concerns that Highway 200 was badly broken up and injuries could occur, creating more pressure to reopen I-90. Fortunately for MRL, they had a north rail line that paralleled Highway 200. They otherwise risked losing money by the hour. At 6 p.m., the tech group met at Station 5 to update the status of the chlorine tanks. There will be another air monitoring tomorrow at daybreak, they said. At that time, we will review the evacuation area and determine if it can be decreased. Marine and Environmental Testing Incorporated of Portland, Oregon, plan to set up systematic air monitoring stations on Saturday. In the late afternoon, Missoula Rural Fire Chief Bill Reed had told the media that the gas had dissipated enough at the spill site to allow people to approach as close as 50 yards without wearing protective gear. But chlorine levels near the cars made safety assumptions a guessing game, especially since systematic monitoring had yet to begin. Marine later drew a schematic map of the core of the hot zone with the 5 tankers at its heart. Direct recorded chlorine levels ran the gamut during a 50-minute span between 6 and 7 p.m. on April 13, of 0 parts per million just north of the cars, 6 parts per million 25 feet to the east, and up to 50 parts per million in the ditch to the south. The next morning, the highest hits were to the north. Sunday evening, levels peaked to the west. Micro-weather conditions as well as thawing of ice skins made chlorine forecasts near the tanks unpredictable. Protection was essential. In the days after the initial rupture, level A and B personal protection equipment were generally required. Any other approach was toxic roulette. People at the site would often spin the wheel. The techs still didn't know how many leakers they had, but releases had quieted, as had complaints beyond the exclusion zone. A sense of calm and lowered risk settled in, a relative containment. At the last IC briefing of April 12, the animal rescue seemed a tentative go. Allowing residents back to visit and rescue animals outside the hot zone was considered safe based on limited readings away from the site. On the eve of the animal rescue, John Ziman of 6 Mile spent the night at home, his family in Missoula. Saturday morning, he said, my eyes were burning, my throat was burning. You could still kind of smell the chlorine. 6 Mile Valley was surrounded by mountains. It takes a good wind to blow it out of here, he said. Ziman took their pets and stayed out another week. To the northwest on Friday evening, Jerry Schweitzer smelled chlorine at her home several miles up 9 Mile Valley, north of the spill. It kept getting stronger, she said. I could smell a little chlorine, but I didn't think too awful much about it. Schweitzer saw no visible cloud. But during the night, she said, probably early morning, I woke up and my eyes were streaming and my throat was burning and my nose was burning. Schweitzer was a nearby neighbor of the Chalmers, who had fled on April 11. However the gas arrived in outlying areas, chlorine continued to vaporize at the spill site. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, residents visit the exclusion zone to feed or rescue animals left behind, with some reporting that the visit makes them ill. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.